Hello, welcome to Civilization Jihad Awareness, the show where truth wins every time. Now, let's talk about where that term civilization jihad comes from. It's not something I made up. It is something that the Muslim Brotherhood of North America created. And what does it mean? It simply means, believe it or not, settlement. And where did I learn that? From the Muslim Brotherhood themselves. They wrote about this term in a document called the Explanatory Memorandum that was created in 1991 that was used in the 2007 United States versus Holy Land Foundation trial, which was the largest terrorism finance trial in the history of the United States. Now, I'm going to read one paragraph from that, and you'll see where the term comes from. It says simply this. This is the heading: Understanding the Role of the Muslim Brotherhood in North America. The process of settlement is a civilization jihadist process with all the word means. The Ikhwan must understand that their work in America is a kind of grand jihad in eliminating and destroying the Western civilization from within and sabotaging its miserable house by their hands and the hands of the believers, so that it is eliminated and God's religion is made victorious over all other religions. Without this level of understanding, we are not up to this challenge and have not prepared ourselves for jihad yet. It is a Muslim's destiny to perform jihad and work wherever he is and wherever he lands until the final hour comes. And there is no escape from that destiny except for those who choose to slack. But would the slackers and the mujahideen be equal? Now, when we're talking about civilization jihad, we also talk about the concept of settlement. And in Europe, this is taking on a whole new twist. I've written about the hijra, which is another word for migration. It's Arabic for migration. It's basically a secret doctrine in Islam that they move for the purpose, believe it or not, it's for jihad. Now, a war can be cold. We've experienced that. We've seen the Cold War. A war can be quiet, using alternative forms of warfare. It can also be hot, and that's the thing. We're not seeing the hot war. We're seeing the constant moving in. Now, I invited Mr. Nyquist and Dr. Anca-Maria Cernea to come join me today because of their usage of the term migration, which again is the same as hijra, and their discussion of the Russian influence utilizing their knowledge of the hijra. Let me tell you a little bit. Jeff Nyquist, he's seen online as J.R. Nyquist. Jeff Nyquist is an expert on Russian and communist military and foreign policy. He's currently an independent journalist and writer based out of Eureka, California. He has previously worked for WorldNet Daily and Newsmax.com. He now writes for FinancialSense.com and is the author of a book, Origins of the Fourth World War. I'm going to recommend people buy this, and you're going to see why after listening to what he's going to tell you today. Unfortunately, because of the time restraints, I'm on the East Coast, and Dr. Cernea is in Romania. It was a little difficult because it would be really early in the morning for her. But we are at the point where I'm just going to bring on Mr. Nyquist. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Nyquist. Hello?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Oh, perfectly. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. I'm just overjoyed that you went. It's Dr. Cernea. Is that correct pronunciation?
Dr. Cernea is how you pronounce.
Thank you.
It's 1 o'clock in the morning in Romania, and she had a commitment early tomorrow morning, so she was not able to join us. I'm sorry.
That's all right. I have to say thank you, first of all, for writing this article. I know that the Center for Security Policy published it, but I grabbed it the first time when I saw it come out, and I'm just really excited because this explains some of the stuff that it provides some answers for some of the things that I've been looking at, particularly the migration into Europe, why it is so massive. And I think I think your research into this is outstanding. So, Mr. Nyquist, you start out your paper with an interesting comment on the Soviet Union history. You say 40 years ago, a serious long-term problem confronting Moscow was the USSR's fast-growing Muslim population. It was then speculated that the Soviet Union's high Muslim birth rate would turn the USSR into a majority Muslim country by the middle of the 21st century. You go on, it's a strange joke, Cherna, go on. It's a strange joke and more than a curious twist of fate that NATO faces the same prospect today. Can you please tell us a little about the speculation that Islam would take over the Soviet Union?
Well, if you remember, I'm 60 years old now, so I remember, being in undergraduate and graduate school. When I was an undergraduate in the late 1970s, political science professors discussing the problems of the Soviet Union would say something on the order of, well, the Soviet Muslim population is growing much more rapidly than the Soviet European population and is going to overtake it sometime around, well, you guessed it, sometime in the first half of the 21st century, and that this is going to be a major problem for the Russians. Well, it turns out that, who would have guessed in 1979 that now, in the year 2018, the reality was going to be quite different, that we're talking about Londonistan for London, we're talking about Europe being a giant Arab or Muslim territory now with these massive migrations, and there's great concern, great agitation in Europe, as we can see, especially in recent weeks. So, it is curious. What we didn't understand about the Soviet Union, what Sovietologists have a hard time understanding, is the way in which Islam was aligned with the communist regime from the beginning and how it was integrated into the Soviet Union and how the Soviet Union exported a liberation theology brand of Islam that was they were able to work with it and make it be effective for them. They're not afraid of Islam like we are. They see it as a weapon. They see it as an ally. It's a very curious difference between us and them.
And I'm going to get back into this one a little bit later, but I think I have a question later on that reflects this. But your paper sets up this was an interesting part. Your paper sets up what I wrote down as a tri-unity of cooperation between governments and ISIS that is rarely, if ever, discussed in the media. The unity was between Russia, Iran, and ISIS. Mr. Nyquist, how did you learn about this, and what can you tell us about it?
Well, I'm a student of what the Russians did in Afghanistan and in Chechnya. And this was the same kind of thing they did there, where they engineered wars or conflicts in which they were controlling the major players on each side of the conflict, even if it's a multi-sided conflict. In the case of, Iran is really a satellite of Moscow. The leaders of Iran were educated at Moscow State University, many of them. It is believed by our intelligence people even that some of these leaders are probably agents of the KGB or GRU going back many years, what is now called the SVR, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service. As far as now, you have this conflict in the Middle East between the Sunni and Shia Islam, particularly in Iraq, and it's really intriguing when you find that ISIS is being supported economically by technicians from China and Russia, while it's ostensibly fighting Iranian forces, Iranian-backed Iraqi forces, American-backed Iraqi forces, because there's this weird confluence with the United States having created a Shiite state in Iraq, and Iraq really sort of in the process of becoming a satellite of Iran. It gets very complicated, but the way we don't understand, we like clear cut in the West. We like, that's the enemy, here's our friends, it's them versus us. No, that's not the Asiatic mindset. That's not the way Muslim strategists or Russian or Chinese strategists think. They think in terms of having control, different sides of the same conflict, having allies on both sides. And it's got a name. The Russians gave it. It's called the scissors strategy. The Russians also have another word for it, but it's less understood. It's the word provocation. Provokatia is the Russian word. And this is really being engaged. So when you look at Russia supporting ISIS and then pretending to bomb ISIS or actually bombing some ISIS forces, when you see the Iranians fighting ISIS but then doing things behind closed doors with ISIS, it's a great puzzle. It's like, what's going on here? How is there this conflict, but then there's not a conflict, or there's collaboration? It is because there is this strong belief in creating controlled conflict, in drawing countries like the United States or other countries into it, and creating strategic misunderstandings in their enemies, and creating a confluence of events in which they can control the outcome of the events. Does that make sense?
Is, yeah. So you're saying that the goal in the long run is to control the outcome. And,
yes. Well,
and that is the purpose of moving, in the long run, is the purpose of creating an influence that causes a move into Europe, which would in some ways destabilize things, correct?
yes. Let me give you a simple example of the scissors strategy as it applies to a simpler area of the globe. You know the conflict between India and Pakistan.
Yes.
Right? It's Hindu versus Muslim. It's been around for many decades now, since India became free from British rule. You have the Soviet Union, of course, has been in the past. We're talking 1960s and 70s. Was supplying India with weapons, military advice. They were kind of aligned with, India was aligned with Moscow. You had Pakistan aligned with Beijing, right? And you had this idea of a Sino-Soviet split itself. Now, if you study the Sino-Soviet split, you'll find there's evidence. And I talked to one GRU defector, Colonel Stanislav Lunev, and he said that he saw things when he was a GRU, that Soviet military sinologist who worked in China. He said, no, Russia and China were allied in the 80s, and before that they were working together secretly. They were playing a scissors strategy. Now, how it applied to India and Pakistan is that the Russians could divide up their labor, Chinese. They could penetrate India, and the Chinese could penetrate Pakistan, and then they could get control on each side of this conflict, and then they could use this conflict. And the analogy is the scissors. You got a scissors, it's got two blades. They each cut against each other. But when you pick up a scissors, you're not going to cut yourself with it. You're going to cut somebody else with it, aren't you? So that's the idea. They're taking a conflict in which they can control the blades and bring them down, bring those blades down to cut something, to destroy. And what they can destroy, for example, in India and Pakistan, they could use their control, the Russian control in India. They can go to the Chinese and say, we have this intelligence on these people, now you can kill them or blow them up or assassinate them. And the Chinese could go to the Russians and say, tell your Indian allies they can kill these people. Why would the Chinese want to kill certain Pakistanis? Why would the Russians want to kill certain Indians? Because to improve their control over those countries. In the scissors strategy, you are destroying elements of the political spectrum in order to gain greater control over the people that you're working with, and the country they're controlling or the movement they're controlling. And of course, in the Middle East, this game is much more complicated than the Indian subcontinent. In the Middle East, you have so many different countries and factions, and you also have countries like Turkey, countries like Egypt, countries like Israel. Then you have Europe right next door, where you have this influx of Muslim refugees. And then you have, on the other end of Europe, you have the anti-immigrant parties who are growing closer and closer to Russia. A good example is in Austria. These parties are right-wing parties that favor Vladimir Putin, right? So
yes.
When Russia,
I think you mentioned. I think you mentioned Hungary as being closer now to Russia than it has been in years.
Yes, and we debated whether to discuss Hungary in detail in the paper. We decided against it because of the complexity. But to just give you an idea, is that Hungary is remarkably close to Russia, where Poland and Romania are not. And the importance here, I think it's that the Russians have made promises under the table to the Hungarians, because the Hungarians are angry at the loss of territory at the end of the war to the Romanians and to others. And so there's this old grievance related to Hungarian nationalism. So the Russians can play on it, even though the Hungarians might not particularly have a great fondness for the Russians. They will work with them and become closer to them because they think they're going to get what they want. And that's beneath the surface. So the Hungarians were allowed to shield themselves from the refugees because they were partnering with the Russians, and the Russians were using it as a weapon, particularly against Germany and the Western NATO countries that were allowing this flood to happen. Because why? Because right now Russia's arming and rearming. They've taken territory from Ukraine, and of course the natural thing would be for Germany to begin rearmament and for NATO to. But when you have 1 million Muslims pouring into Germany and they have to support them, and it's billions and billions of euros to deal with this problem, all the money that would have gone to rearmament for Germany is gone. And that's just one of the benefits that the Russians get from helping to facilitate this event, this mass migration, intensification of an existing problem, really, but a really serious intensification.
I hadn't even thought about the financial angle. That does make a great deal of sense. I hadn't even caught that one. Wow.
Well, I think we have a quote in the paper about it costing the Russians, I think, $1,000 per person. I'm going by memory now, to move them into Europe, and then it costs Germany, 100 times that to pay for the people once they've arrived.
I think there's a recent article out there. Yeah, there's a recent article out there. It was either Sweden or Germany is spending $1 billion currently on migrants. It's just, a year on migrants, $1 billion a year.
Yeah.
Unfreaking
and
believable.
that's only one of the costs. There's law enforcement costs, and there's all kinds of costs.
Education,
to these
yes.
Mm-hmm.
Healthcare,
yeah, they're not included. Yeah. Housing and feeding is only one thing, and if these people remain in Germany it's in 1 year, I think they consume 10 times what it costs to get them there. If they're there for 10 years, it's 100 times the cost over a 10-year period. And then you have the problem that they won't integrate into a Western society because they're not Western.
I want to ask you a question regarding the Cold War and how that relates. I have young kids. I work in a high school, and it's so hard for kids today because they didn't live through the Cold War to grasp some of the angst that we grew up with not trusting. We did not trust Russia. We did not trust Soviet Union. We didn't trust we didn't trust anyone who was communist. And it's so hard for them to grasp this. So I'm just hoping you can give me something to reach that to the kids and explain this fear. But now we're starting to see it reach out. I do want to read a quote that you made. You wrote about, according to Gadowski, Russia's game is to checkmate Europe and, to a lesser extent, the United States. Tell us about this quote, and are you in agreement with it?
Yes, I think he's got it right. He may have a slightly different idea of it than I do, but that's the thing, is that this is so complicated that what I recognize is that a lot of these close observers in Eastern Europe, they really know what they're looking at. But we don't know, because we don't know exactly all the different Russian strategic thoughts that are behind it. But we can see some of them. We can see them in evidence, so that we do have an idea. This is a move against Europe. Like I just mentioned, it's a financial hit. It helps to prevent rearmament. It creates social chaos in countries like Germany. It also creates political divisions in European countries. And political divisions, particularly what I understand, and it may be that Gadowski understands this too, that the political division is they're creating by this a rift, a very strong polarization in the politics of various Western countries, in which you have the left, which has always been sympathetic to communist ideas on the one side, and you have an anti-American, anti-immigrant right emerging. The Russians have invested a lot in infiltrating in certain countries. And that means this is a win-win for the Russians. If they create these two groups as powerful, they win if either one wins. Because if the anti-immigrant pro-Russian right in Europe wins, then NATO falls apart. In America, they wave goodbye to us because we're too politically correct. And I think when this policy was, look back at when this started, back in 2014, 2013, when, in 2014, when this immigration thing was going on, they thought that Hillary Clinton was going to be the next president. I mean, nearly everybody has thought she would be the next president. Until Election Day, they thought she was going to win. And imagine if Hillary Clinton were president and you had the victory of one of these anti-immigrant parties. Let's say Le Pen had won in France. Imagine Hillary Clinton calling the French deplorables, the way she called the Trump voters in America. She would have alienated Europe. Germany's now getting rid of Merkel. Germany's making this shift. It's inevitable. When you pump a country full of Muslims, the country is going to turn away from the left to the right. The Russians have guaranteed that right is going to be an anti-American right. And then if you have this left-wing American president calling them deplorables, you see how that dynamic could work?
Yes.
It's pretty
only
clear
now
from
they're
what
going to
I've
be
looked at. Yeah.
Only now they're going to end up
go
aligning
ahead.
with us. And
well, yes. You see, the Russians really got hurt badly when Trump was elected because they pretended to like him, because they were pretending. They had a dilemma. They had to pretend to like Trump because they're supporting people like Trump in Europe. And so they couldn't really seem so inconsistent as to not to seem to support him. And they played off that well, but they never imagined he would win. Nobody really took that seriously, right?
I
when he won,
I never thought he would. I never thought he would either.
Yeah. And by the way, that's why they have to play up this Trump as a Russian puppet thing, because the left has to desperately take control in America so that they can align properly against the anti-immigrant parties in Europe to create, because what Russia's objective is to split America from Western Europe so that NATO collapses. The number one strategic objective of the Russian Federation and the Soviet Union has been the elimination of NATO, because it's the one obstacle to them dominating Europe.
That makes a lot of sense. Your paper also talks about an interview you did. I don't know if it's you or Dr. Cernea did it in 2013. In June 2013, this is what it says. In June 2013, Jeff Nyquist interviewed a disaffected KGB officer in Russia named Viktor Kalashnikov. In reference to Syria, the former KGB lieutenant colonel said, "It's all about struggle against the United States. All allies are measured in terms of their anti-Americanism. If they are anti-American, they are our friends." Kalashnikov then referred to the deployment of terrorist armies. Armies composed of terrorists, said Kalashnikov, were better than old-fashioned Soviet tank armies. They were more flexible and cheaper than tanks. The head of the Russian state has publicly warned the West that arms deliveries to the opposition in Syria might result in terrorist attacks against Europe. That's clear casus belli, a real terrorist threat, said Kalashnikov. Am I correct in saying that Putin believes the Cold War lives through manipulation of terrorist groups? Is this
yes.
One more thing with that. And this is despite the World FIFA tournament in Russia being threatened by ISIS?
Oh, yeah. Well, they have to have an alibi. It's got to be, in Chechnya and to to a lesser extent Afghanistan, the Russians built an alibi for themselves in Chechnya. The terrorist forces in Chechnya that were supposedly attacking Russian targets were actually under Russian control. This is something that the KGB FSB defector Alexander Litvinenko was very famous. He wrote a very famous book called The FSB Blows Up Russia. You may recall the book. He was famous for being poisoned by Putin's assassins with polonium in London in 2006. And I think it was November 1st, 2006 that they poisoned him at a hotel in London. And Litvinenko was because he had worked in Chechnya, because he had worked in certain areas of the Russian special services, he was in possession of knowledge. For example, he was responsible for protecting the secrecy of Ayman al-Zawahiri when Zawahiri was in Russia in 1996 being trained in Dagestan by the Russian special services. And he published on this. He gave 2 interviews about it, and he was very frustrated in attempting to warn British military and intelligence, and they just simply didn't do anything about it. But he was saying, look, the Russians are behind Al-Qaeda. And he knew this because the Al-Qaeda leaders were Russian, long-time KGB agents. And he said Zawahiri, who's now the head of Al-Qaeda, was the number 2 man under bin Laden, was a long-time Russian agent. And so he was trying to warn the West. He was trying to tell people, look, you're not getting this. You're not understanding this. And, of course, like many, if you look at the Chechen Civil War, one of the things that in his book he brings out is the first act of so-called major act of Chechen terror he mentions in his book was the blowing up of a rail bridge on the Don River near Rostov. And the bomber accidentally blew himself up, right?
Yes,
and
I remember
of course,
this.
They found, in his remains, they found his KGB identification cards. Yeah. So this is, so it was a KGB agent staging a provocation, what's called a provocation. It was an event attributed to Chechen terrorists. Famously, the Mufti Kadyrov, who was the father of the current president of Chechnya, was a Muslim, a Chechen Muslim, who gave an interview when the Second Chechen War began, a few months after it began, to a British Muslim magazine, in which he described the war as controlled by both sides by the Russian special services. And he called on all Chechens not to join the war because they would be caught up in what was essentially a Russian operation. And by the way, he made that statement before Putin made him president of the country. And it's a very fascinating interview. I based a couple of articles I wrote. This was in January of the year 2000, right after Putin came to power as president. Putin had, interestingly, Putin first became prime minister of Russia just before the Second Chechen War started. And his predecessor was the man, according to Kadyrov, who set up the Second Chechen War, who actually organized. He claimed that the Russian Interior Ministry organized the incursion into Dagestan by the Islamists. So it's when you read this stuff and you go, what? The Russians are behind the Islamists in the little civil war in Russia in a place called Chechnya? Yes. And then you find out that many of the so-called leading Chechen terrorists were trained by the GRU, by Soviet military, and by Spetsnaz. And they fought in Afghanistan, many of them, by the way. It was really quite a show. In fact, when you study the Chechen War, you find famous Chechen commanders who were supposedly dead suddenly holding press conferences post-mortem. And you're going, what? This guy died. How can he suddenly be resurrected? So there was some editing in the script here. And that these events
sounds like
were...
CNN covered it.
Yes. Well, you see, there's massive falsification, and the same thing in Afghanistan. Look, you have Milt Bearden implying in his book on Afghanistan. This is the CIA guy that was supplying the Mujahideen in fighting the Soviets, of saying that some of these Mujahideen groups, where the battles they were having with the Soviets were either they knew they were fake, or they were suspected of being fake, and of course the Mohammed Fahim, who was the intelligence chief for the Northern Alliance, working under Ahmed Shah Massoud, the famous Tajik Afghan commander, was a KGB trained, Soviet agent. And when, after about the same time as 9/11, when Ahmed Shah Massoud was assassinated with a bomb, if you remember, Fahim who took over. So at that moment, you see, the Northern Alliance was Russian backed. They were coming back to power. Who brought them to power in Afghanistan? We did. President Bush's bombing campaign against the Taliban brought Russia's surrogates in Russia back to power in Kabul. And in fact, Hamid Karzai, Hamid Karzai was running around the country saying, "I'm not the real leader of the country. Mohammed Fahim is, and he's a Russian agent." But nobody in the Western press covered any of this. And so NATO was basically fighting in Afghanistan to maintain the heroin trade for Russia, right? And its Russian agents to control. I mean, this is one aspect. So to understand the double game and what the Russians get out of it, you have to understand that the events that, as we understand them, we don't understand them, and we haven't understood them for decades.
So this is, again, it's a scissors game, and that's what we're not watching for, and that is how Russia operates. Wow.
Yeah.
One more big question. Your paper states, quote, in October 2015, the Czech Minister of Defense, Martin Strapinsky, suggested that Russia was possibly financing transporting refugees to Europe. Okay, although I do not have 100% proof of this information, he said, I cannot discount it either. Can you tell us, you've pretty much answered this, though. Can you tell us why Russia would assist armed Islamic terrorists? I think that's the point. They were talking about Islamic terrorists being put in the midst. You were talking about in the midst of these refugees, and that I think is a great note, to a great place to answer. I mean, we're towards the end. I mean, what does Russia gain from putting terrorists on the ground in Europe?
Well, of course, it's diversionary. There's many things. One is it has a diversionary quality. You see, Russia's building up. The Russians started 3-4 years ago building tank armies again, Guards tank armies. This is the first time since the end of the Cold War they put together these powerful armies. And Europe is not able to, Europe is busy dealing with, you had the Paris attacks, you had the attacks in Belgium, you've had attacks in Germany. You have suddenly the security forces and intelligence assets and resources of the various European countries of NATO is focused on this internal threat. It's just their attention. It's a matter of attention. You can't put your attention on everything. So they're not focused on Russia, which is, of course, becoming more threatening, and they ought to be watching it, and they ought to be trying to understand what the Russians are doing. But they're caught up. They've had, threats to sports events and people running over people with trucks and exploding bombs and shooting people down in the streets. So this is obviously a grave concern because, it's you have to stop these terrorist attacks, and it requires a lot of effort when you've got millions of Muslims and thousands of terrorists, maybe tens of thousands of them embedded in your society.
Wow. And this is what we're seeing. I mean, we've talked about how this is happening in Great Britain. I was in Germany, and we did talk to was in the Ministry of the Interior there, and they can't possibly. I mean, I was